Great. So hello and welcome everyone to today's WFO webinar on the current and future challenges for floating offshore wind. My name is Gunnar Herzig. I'm the Managing Director of WFO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome today's three excellent speakers. We have Bruno G, Chief Sales and Marketing Officer at BW Ideol. Then we have Marco Wiedeek, Vice President Business Development at Principal Power, and Marcus Thor, CEO at Hexicon. So welcome, Bruno, Marco, and Marcus. Great to have you with us today. And before we jump into the discussion, let me just quickly tell you a few things about WFO and who we are. So WFO is a non-profit organization founded in 2018, and our members represent the complete offshore wind value chain, and we have an international setup with offices in Hamburg and Singapore. And in terms of what we do, so our activities, it's very straightforward. We lobby for offshore wind on a global scale and talk to regulators and government officials, especially in new emerging offshore wind markets. We inform about offshore wind and publish reports and statistics on the global offshore wind industry. And we connect the industry by organizing events, nowadays, of course, mainly online events, but hopefully one day soon again live events to make sure people can meet each other and talk about offshore wind in person. If we take a look at our members, you can see that we have a broad range of members, more than 60 by now, including all different types of companies, large utilities, small specialized engineering firms from around the world, Europe, Asia, North America. And if you are not a member of WFO yet, please make sure to check out our website and make sure to join us. Would be great to welcome you also as a WFO member in the future. That was just it in terms of WFO. And of course, since we're talking about floating offshore wind today, always good to mention our Floating Offshore Wind Committee, which is a very, very prominent discussion forum within WFO. And if you're particularly interested in floating, make sure to join WFO in order to then participate in our very dynamic Floating Offshore Wind Committee. Yes, so now it's time for our speakers and their opening statements. Today we have a slightly different structure than from our usual webinars. We'll be having brief opening statements from all our three speakers, and then we will jump into the discussion. First, I will ask a few questions, and then afterwards, feel free to submit questions via the chat function on your control panel on the right-hand side, and then we'll be more than happy to also take questions from the audience. So I think with that, it's my pleasure to hand over to Bruno for his opening statement. Bruno, over to you.
Yes, hello Gunnar, thanks for having me on. Hello to my distinguished co-panelists and to the audience interested in floating wind. So pretty excited to be here today as BW Ideol is started to trade on the Oslo stock market this morning. BW Ideol is basically Ideol with stronger financial backing and the company behind two full-scale demonstrators in operation for the last couple of years on two prominent markets, which are Japan and France. So our business model remains the same. We are a technology provider, a proven technology provider, may I add, a project co-developer, and we intend as BW Ideol to pursue the roadmap that Ideol had set before. So I'm very pleased to be here, and again, no longer as Ideol's Chief Sales and Marketing Officer, but from now on as BW Ideol's Chief Sales and Marketing Officer. Thank you very much, Gunnar. I look forward to the discussions amongst the panelists and look forward to answering the questions of the audience, and that is why I will limit my statement to what I just said for the last couple of minutes. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Bruno. And now it's over to Marco for his opening remarks. And I think, Marco has a few slides to share. So those slides should be up on the screen. Yeah, there we go. If you just go to presentation mode, Marco, then I think we can see your slides. And then that should all work well. There you go. Yeah, perfect. There we go. Over to you, Marco.
Okay, thank you, Gunnar, and thank you, Bruno, also for your opening statement. Marcus Thor, VP Business Development for Principal Power, since 5 months in the floating industry. So still a little bit of a new kid on the block, but background in offshore oil and gas, and also in my last position in bottom fixed wind. So bringing some experience to floating wind that we all need. A little bit of Principal Power. I think a lot of people are familiar with Principal Power already through the different projects that we have already in the water. Founded in 2007, so a long history of developing the floating wind technology that has resulted in various projects that we have executed. Headquarters in California, office in Portugal, where I'm part of, in France, where our operational center resides, and we have offices in UK and Japan, where we serve our clients to their needs. Of course, our technology called the wind float. You can see the picture. Proven technologies in multiple ocean environments. I'll show you in the next slide a couple of conditions that our wind floats have been going through offshore. Interested to see, and that's where we gather our experience and knowledge on the performance of the floaters in the water. We have generated over 65 gigawatt hours of energy, and of course with a global portfolio. Here you can see a little bit of our track records. As I mentioned, started in 2007, 2008, and already 4 projects in the water, and starting to develop the next series of projects. And here you get to see a little bit of the wind floats in the water. The first picture that you see is in the world of the wind float 1. Where you can see a huge wave going through the wind float. The wind float resists these conditions without any problems. So I think these videos fairly clearly show the experience that we have now with the actual conditions in the oceans, and that's what we can bring to our clients. These type of experiences. Okay, I'll give it back to you, Gunnar.
Perfect, great. Thank you very much, Marco. Very impressive video, great to see that. And yeah, so with that, over to Marcus to make his opening remarks. And I think Marcus also has one slide for us. Yeah, there we go, perfect. Marcus, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Gunnar, and thank you for the invitation, and look forward to the discussion. So very briefly from my side as well, first of all, my name is Marcus Thor, and I'm the CEO of Hexicon. Although I only have 2 weeks of experience being the CEO here, so fairly new in this position, but not new in the industry nor Hexicon. So I've been here for some over 8 years now at Hexicon. Hexicon in brief, we do 2 things. So we're both a developer and a technology provider and developers of technology as well, with a business model that is carved out and more asset light, in the way that on the project development part of things, we like to see ourselves as the early stage developer. So in typical more immature markets, the early stage developments from outset into the early days is where we focus and have our skill set and tools. Equally so on the technology side of things, we do the general and the conceptual developments and the IP, whilst we're not in possession of an engineering team of 50 or 100 people, but we work very much with partners in the project developments, and we work with partners and consultants in the technology. And it's through that asset light way of working that we think that we can, with a rather slim team, also scale this business model into several opportunities and markets. So I think I'll leave it as that as well for an opening statement from me. So thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Marcus. And yeah, thanks very much to all of you for those opening statements. So I think, yeah, we can now jump straight into the discussion. And since the topic of the webinar is current and future challenges for floating offshore wind, I think, yeah, it makes sense to really ask for those challenges in the very beginning. So if you had to select the 1 or 2 top challenges to really achieve the commercial breakthrough for floating offshore wind, what would those challenges be from your point of view? And maybe we go in the reverse order, Marcus first, then Marco, then Bruno, if that's okay. So yeah, Marcus, feel free to pick your top 2 challenges.
Well, I think we're really at the breaking point or the inflection point here when there's a lot of planning ongoing for commercial scale floating wind farms. But let's remember that we're not there already. And I don't see it as a challenge necessarily, but I think it's crucial that we get to that point where the world can see that some of these projects make it, have successful FIDs and build outs of scale. That's really crucial in the next few years. But if I look at focusing on challenges, as the question was here, I think there's a couple to just highlight. And one in my head is there's still, if you look at track record of floating wind, they're not at commercial scale yet. So there's still 2 things that I thought of when you asked this question. One is on the health and safety side of things. We still have very limited hours out operating, installing and operating floating wind. And we need to not forget that if you look at oil and gas, that's 40 plus years. So that element, I think, is crucial that we remain a safe environment and keep focus on that. So that it's not in the first few projects that we have incidents. I think that would be very damaging. And a second that springs to mind is still the technology aspects, novel pieces when it comes to insurers and banks. And here I'm thinking about the elements that are new when you compare to fixed bottom, which is the floaters, absolutely. But also here I'm thinking about the dynamic cable part of the electrical infrastructure as well as the mooring system. And it's not, I'm of course a true believer that there are a lot of ways to make this work very sufficiently and effectively without damages, but without the track record, and that is an issue short term to get the appropriate financing at scale into this.
Great, sounds good. Thanks, Marcus. Marco, over to you. Your top 1 or 2 challenges for floating wind.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Gunnar. Yeah, the first challenge, of course, to get to commercial scale is realizing these commercial scale projects that clients will bring to the market. I think where we are now is there are competing technologies that are proven that allow us to go from demonstrators to bigger scale. What is required for that, of course, is also legislation and regulation by governments in place to clearly create an outlook to the market that the industry is ready to take off, and that also the supply chain will be positioned for turning to floating wind and also invest in infrastructure that will allow us to bring this wind flow technology to commercial scale. So far, of course, the projects have been relatively small from a fabrication point of view. So the big challenge will be how we create the delivery models to go from maybe five units to 50 or 100 units. So that is where we are focusing on. So yeah, I think that's an important challenge to overcome, that we create the framework and the environment to allow these commercial projects to be realized.
Perfect. Yeah, Bruno, over to you.
Well, it's going to be hard to repeat what my colleagues have said, but basically, I see the key challenge is no longer about technology or scaling up, because there are technologies that are proven and bankable and can have access to non-recourse financing and insurance. And it's true that a proven track record in rough conditions, demonstrating the capability, the seakeeping capabilities of the floater and of the technology, and the keeping of the power curve. That is, of course, a key thing. But the biggest challenge, in my opinion, is essentially, and not to go too far to what Marco said, is of course getting the proper regulatory environment in all the markets where floating wind has a potential. And I would go beyond that. I'll say the real big challenge is convincing our political leaders, political decision makers, that we need volumes and visibility, because without a clear roadmap in terms of so many gigawatts in a region or even globally, it's going to be very hard for the supply chain to commit and to invest. So I think the biggest challenge is trying to convince policymakers, political decision makers, one, to put offshore wind as a priority, and to make sure that they create a national roadmap where floating wind will see a potential of several gigawatts over the next few years, over the next decades. That will spur investment, that will spur mobilization, that will spur competition, that will bring down the cost. So I think the big challenge, again, is more a lobbying challenge at this point. After that, depending on the status of a technology, there are different challenges. Some companies that are still have not put a full-scale solution in the water, well, I see that their key challenges is identifying testing grounds and test sites, even getting access to wind turbines, which is a major issue nowadays. And then, of course, obtain all the financing and identify and sources of financing to finance such full-scale prototypes. For companies with a bigger track record, like Principal Power, like Equinor's Hywind, and like Ideol, or BW Ideol rather, the challenges are a little different. There, of course, our challenges are trying to further optimize our technology or solutions based on our return on experience, and convince, again, the investors, the decision makers, the project and the asset developers that our solution can be built and serially produced within a reasonable amount of time, can demonstrate an OPEX that is, despite the 2 or 3 years or 4 years of return on experience, demonstrates a certain know-how of OPEX and O&M operations. And then first and foremost, also demonstrate that our solutions are fully compatible with the next generations of wind turbines in the 15 to 20 megawatt range. So again, depending on the status of the technology, I see different challenges, but there's one challenge for all, is getting those, getting governments to commit to gigawatts of floating in the next decade. I think that is the biggest efforts we all have to unite around.
Perfect, thanks, Bruno. And maybe to follow up on what you said, also what Marco said in terms of regulation and the importance of proper regulation for floating offshore wind. Would there be anything in addition to a sort of roadmap or long-term roadmap, anything specifically in terms of regulations that you would like to see from governments around the world to help floating offshore wind, whether it's things we've seen in the UK, a separate bucket for floating offshore wind, or a specific remuneration regime, CFD contracts in place, or so, anything specific with regards to regulation you would think would help the breakthrough of floating wind? Maybe same order again, Marcus first, then Marco, then Bruno?
Yeah, I think speaking of framework and legislation, I think that is a couple of notes and from my side of it. You know, how can I completely agree on this build out, and we need, I mean, floating wind really has the potential to be built out in scale, not constrained by shallow water, and to do that in a way that is supported by governments, absolutely, but also that avoids unnecessary conflict. And let's remember, there's been a lot of conflict with stakeholders in the onshore industry, and then going on to bottom fix as well. So how do we create an environment where we'll never get out of stakeholders in its entirety, but to minimize that? And we have the potential to do so with floating wind because it's not constrained by shallow water. It doesn't need to be near shore. So there's good opportunity here. And I'm thinking of two things. One is in South Korea, where we're active at the moment, they have a support scheme is regulated where you're remunerated higher the further offshore you are. And that's a quite clever way to place these wind farms a bit further offshore, which is possible with floating wind, that avoids conflict with nearshore activity, where it's more densely fished, avoid visual pollution, etc. So that's one way to do it. The other, as a support part, I just want to mention Sweden as an example. We're not most advanced in any way, but we're starting to get there, where there is a proposal now from the government to make the grid connection part of the project cost to be cost neutral to onshore wind. And I know that we have this in other jurisdictions in Europe already, but basically what that means allows you to do is to place place power generation in terms of offshore wind rather than onshore wind, and not necessarily near coast. So these legislation types, to avoid conflicts, unnecessary conflicts with stakeholders, that still allows for an economic offshore floating wind project, that I think is something that most or all jurisdictions would really benefit from, to see a fast build out of floating wind, which is really needed to produce meet these targets and ultimately reach climate neutrality before we all grow too old.
Great, thanks, Marcus. Marco, your views on specific regulations that will help the industry?
Yeah, Marcus addressed already a couple of important things. I think the main thing is provide clarity and predictability in regulation, so the industry knows what it can expect and plan accordingly. So that is utmost and foremost that we need to create. The industry needs to have visibility and, as I mentioned, predictability, what it will look like, and any mechanism on top of that to promote or subsidize the technology will help, of course, to create the scale that we need. So in terms of that, facilitating auction rounds, dedicating also areas to floating wind, again, to create opportunities for these projects will help. So any regulation that supports that from building up in the countries where in the regions where we're looking at, will help provide that clarity and visibility.
Great, thanks, Marco. Bruno, your views?
Well, everything has pretty much been said, but what I have to say is today we as an association and as an industry association, WFO, and particularly the Floating Offshore Wind Committee, which I have the privilege to chair, Wind Europe, GWEC, and then the French Wind Energy Association, Scottish Renewables, the Japanese Wind Power Wind Power Association, etc. We all have a duty to keep on educating the policymakers and the local decision makers, and pretty much highlight one thing, that we've seen the cost reduction of fixed bottom over the last years that was quite dramatic. We've seen that, we know that about 70% of the capex of floating wind and fixed bottom are relatively identical. So we have to keep on explaining, demonstrating that the support that fixed bottom has received over the last decades has paid off in terms of job creation, in terms of cost reduction. And when you look at the latest results of the auctions, wherever they may be, and the tenders in France, in the UK, in Holland, in Denmark, in Germany, etc., it's clear that offshore wind is definitely the way to go when you compare that to the cost of nuclear power, for example, and the cost of a Hinkley Point and such. So we just have to keep on, as an organization and as an individual company, wherever we are in the world, keep on hammering and keep on repeating the same thing, so that little by little it sinks in the head of the policymakers. It's sad to say, but that is about as much we can do. It is clear that we have to keep on demanding some support, but perhaps the support that floating wind will require will be much less than what fixed bottom has benefited from, because the cost reduction that has been seen over pretty much 2 decades with fixed bottom can definitely be achieved with floating within less than 1 decade. As our goal as an industry is to achieve a 40 to 60 euros per megawatt hour cost by 2030, which is basically FID 2028, and that is a dramatic thing. So I can only stress the importance of education and piggybacking on the success story that fixed bottom has been.
Perfect. Sounds great. Thanks, Bruno. And then, yeah, one thing that's always of interest to people is which countries do you believe are most promising for floating wind? Marcus, you already mentioned South Korea. Yeah, any views on which countries, maybe in Europe, Asia, and North America, or which regions, if we're talking about big countries like the US, you think are most promising, or maybe some regions that are being a bit overlooked or not as prominently mentioned as others? Your views on the most exciting regions for floating offshore wind on a global scale.
Well, first of all, floating wind is very global, of course, and the large areas of shallow water is not a luxury that is available on a global scale. But with that said, I think it's interesting, relaying back to what Bruno mentioned on volumes and visibility. I think that's really what we see, really large balance sheets coming into this, not the least the oil majors. They're looking for really scale, large scale opportunity. And there I'm a little, afraid, looking long term at least, that we don't have it at least yet the identified areas in Europe, but certainly I see opportunity both over in the US and in Asia. And I won't go through all the countries where floating wind is suitable for, but to mention this scale perspective as I see it, we've got a lot of countries over in Asia, and I wouldn't be surprised if half of the world's floating fleet is in Asia in 10 years or so. And to put some perspective on it, now that we see really large countries moving with net zero targets, etc. To give some perspective, if I know the numbers right, if you take China, India, and Indonesia as an example, that are now starting to talk about renewables, and China, even net zero position by 2060. These are 3 countries that together have 3 billion people and 60% coal in their energy mix today. When these over a few decades are starting transforming over to something else, it needs to be of scale, and it needs to be offshore to some extent, if you look at where the demand centers are. But I think that we've got to isolate on the question, perhaps reflect on a few countries that are of course promising long term, not the least for their need, the geographic prerequisites, as well as their capability of providing local jobs to shipyards, etc. We've got South Korea, we're active, we mentioned, definitely have China as well, and Japan. But perhaps mentioning, which is closer to home as well, over here in Europe, 2 countries to note. I think one is Spain, which is a very large onshore wind nation. And why aren't they offshore yet? Well, simply because they have deep water. And now things are really happening in Spain as well. And the Baltic Sea as an example. So the Baltic Sea is, we don't have a lot of offshore wind at all, not least in Sweden. But here now it's really starting to move as well. And the Baltic Sea, suitable water depth for floating, a somewhat protected ocean. So you have almost as good wind speeds as the North Sea, but you have a milder wave climate, which is, serves well for the floating structures. And we're seeing now there's task force ongoing with the TSOs around the Baltic states to interconnect these countries. And I think that the Baltic Sea as a basin is a very suitable floating wind arena. And we have several of these nations, not the least Sweden, where there is an energy problem. So we have constrained parts of Sweden that is not getting enough electricity, and it needs to be offshore. So that's just a few of them, and perhaps leave a few countries for the other panelists as well.
Great, thanks, Marcus. Yeah, Marco, Bruno, any things you would like to add? Any other countries or regions you feel are particularly exciting?
Yeah, thank you, Marcus, for leaving at least a couple of countries. I think yeah, you addressed it well, also from a macro level. Of course, we can also look at angles from the different countries that promote floating wind. I think Japan, of course, is a good example, that after the nuclear disaster that they had, that they commit to offshore wind. Giving their shoreline that goes immediately to deep water. Of course, they focus immediately on floating wind. There are large offtake possibilities. So yeah, this is an example of a country with clear conditions that favor floating wind. The same can be said of South Korea that Marcus mentioned. I think where the floating wind will be important is where these elements are in place. So offtake, the goals that are set by the governments to go through neutral carbon, that will all facilitate trends to offshore wind, where countries do not have a lot of shallow water. Spain, indeed, Portugal, Ireland, UK, you can see these are good boundary conditions to go towards floating wind. Of course, everybody's looking at the west coast in the US as well. You have some elements there. Also, immediately deep water, good winds. There, the challenge is, of course, the infrastructure that can support the delivery models of the floating wind farms. Yeah, so we also see Asia as a very important market for the future, and Europe as well. And we're waiting to see the US. All these markets have potential. I've been in the industry now, like I mentioned in the beginning, for 5 months. I see a lot of, since I started, a lot of traction. The entry of the oil majors has been mentioned. What I also see now, that let's say the incumbent players from bottom fixed wind are now also gearing up towards floating wind. What I saw in the beginning is that very often the smaller developers, that the early adapters that started developing floating wind, and now we see more and more coming into the fray. The bigger players, the big balance sheet players, and the developers from bottom fixed. So yeah, we will see a lot of new areas also being developed in Asia, and also in Europe, Spain, Mediterranean, Italy, Greece. We will see that for sure. So a lot of potential out there, and the industry is gearing up to deliver that. And I think, yeah, the main challenge that there is indeed the visibility, the volume, and the building up the infrastructure for the delivery of all these floating wind farms.
Great, thank you very much, Marco. Bruno, anything to add on the question of geography?
I mean, my esteemed colleagues mentioned the obvious. Basically, the countries where the floating wind planets are aligned or aligning, which means a strong political desire to implement renewables and to make sure that net zero is achieved within a reasonable amount of time. You need, of course, the proper regulatory framework, and then you need centers of consumption that are not too far from deeper waters. And it's true that when those planets aligned, all the conditions are set for floating wind to succeed. But beyond that, we talked about all the obvious markets, but we should not ignore that floating wind can also respond to other more niche markets. One, of course, is the power to platform, where floating wind can be an answer to power and green oil and gas offshore infrastructures. Let's not ignore the countries where, and that is perhaps one of the other big potential markets, are the markets where the seabed is shallow, and however, where the seabed is also quite challenging for cost-efficient fixed bottom. We all know what's happening in Taiwan, where yes, you have a strong desire to install fixed bottom. You've had this whole process of tenders and zones that have been allocated to developers, but we also hear of some issues where the seabed can be too soft and rendering fixed bottom quite challenging. So there is a huge potential, I believe, and Marcus mentioned the Baltic Sea, but there are areas in the Baltic Sea where the water is rather shallow and where seabed conditions are quite challenging. So you do have those kind of markets where, if the technology allows for a shallow draft, there are some possibilities to go and develop floating wind, where initially fixed bottom could be or was considered. Last but not least, you do have smaller markets, and we talked about Spain, but when we look at Spain, we look at the Canary Islands, where the average cost of energy powered by diesel generators and whatnot, and that is something that is also happening in other parts of the world. You have insular environments where the average cost of energy is quite high, and where floating wind, provided again you achieve some thresholds, I would say probably the 40, 50, 60 megawatt, once you get a certain economy of scale, where floating wind could be an answer to some of those specific insular needs. So that is bottom line. The market for floating is much vaster than we think, and when we see stats and maps where that indicate that floating wind has tremendous potential and could represent 60 to 80% of the possibilities in across the globe, well, there you have it. And that's why the future for floating is bright, and especially when we start to also see left and right that the low-hanging fruit of fixed bottom has been picked, and it's time to go deeper offshore.
Yeah, great, perfect, sounds great, Bruno, thanks. And yeah, we're actually receiving quite a lot of questions around the interaction between the oil and gas industry and floating wind. So maybe, yeah, your views on to what extent more and more oil and gas players involved in floating wind, whether it's on the big super major level with the likes of Total and Equinor being involved, but also on a supply chain level. To what extent does that kind of change the industry maybe, or how is that affecting the industry? Maybe Marco, given your oil and gas background, would you like to go first, and then Bruno and Marcus, if you'd like to add anything after that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, it's a good point. As I mentioned, I worked in the bottom fixed industry before I joined Principal Power, and with a company, a service provider, T&I company in offshore installations, that was originally 100% active in oil and gas, and started diverting in helping with T&I services in bottom fixed, because the market was starting up. And of course, we all know what happened in the oil and gas when the market became the volume of work in the oil and gas industry dried up a little. So service companies were looking at other projects, at other work, and the bottom fixed industry was there to deliver these projects. So many service companies focused on the jobs in the bottom fixed, which created a lot of offer for the projects that were out there. So for the bottom fixed industry, a very good element in creating a lot of competition in that market. And I think that certainly helped taking off the bottom fixed industry, with so much vessels, installation vessels available for the bottom fixed industry, as a result of the oil and gas industry shrinking. because of the trend towards a greener environment, of course, and the oil price that came down. So I think that very much helped building up the bottom fixed industry, with so many players entering the industry. That is definitely good for bottom fixed and also for floating wind, because of course floating wind is still piggybacking on the successes of bottom fixed, like Bruno also mentioned. A lot of lessons learned we immediately can take into floating wind. So for floating wind it will take less time to develop the gigawatts as it did in bottom fixed. That's certainly an important element that will help us. So we still see oil and gas companies, service companies entering floating wind, and I think BW is a good example of that. They also looking at diversifying their services and their knowledge in a different market. It goes to show that a lot of companies active in oil and gas are shifting towards offshore wind. Which will help us a lot of knowledge, experience from oil and gas comes towards floating wind. I'm an example of that myself, having built up a large part of my career in oil and gas in an offshore environment. So also the industry has a larger talent pool to draw from. Since so many people from oil and gas become available with a lot of knowledge in all the foundations that are out there, bottom fixed and also the floating offshore structures. There is a lot of experience, of course, built on in the oil and gas industry that we piggyback on and deploy that in our industry. So yes, we see more and more oil and gas companies and service companies coming to this market, because the market pushes us that way.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Marcus. Anything to add, Bruno or Marcus?
Well, I have a few points in random order. One, well, again, to go along what Marcus said, it is a clear trend for oil and gas majors to transform into energy companies, and renewables is of course one great opportunity for them to do so. I haven't seen many offshore oil and gas companies investing and betting on nuclear. So I think it's rather a good positive sign that renewables are a venue for astute investors, and major oil and gas corporations are not the most I would say are surrounded and are usually very well advised in terms of investments. So that is one thing. That it can offset some of their carbon emissions, of course, there is an interest in that. But I'd like to also stress a couple of other things. Floating offshore wind and offshore wind in general and oil and gas, there are still a few major differences. We are dealing with serial production, serial installation within a very short time period and with strong financial constraints. Now, this is something that the offshore oil and gas industry has not been used to. So there is a need for this paradigm shift where, yes, offshore oil and gas companies have a tremendous expertise in engineering, installing, operating capital-intensive assets offshore, with a tremendous expertise in managing complex projects, with a lot of legal implications, capital-intensive implications, sometimes creative financial setups, often partnerships in a very rough environment. So the offshore oil and gas industry has tremendous things to bring to the floating wind industry, and to the offshore wind industry in general, provided that they quickly understand that money is an object. You can no longer get involved with renewables thinking that money is no object. That is the reflexes that some reflexes need to change. On top of that, again, I do stress, and that justifies also why BW Ideol was created, with the investment of BW Offshore as principal shareholder, is that they saw that indeed some of their knowledge could be transposed and could be diversified into floating wind. After that, again, let's not forget the tremendous talent pool there is in offshore oil and gas. And as we see markets like Norway, like Scotland, where you see risk of future unemployment in the oil and gas, we need to open our arms and welcome all that talent within the offshore wind industry and make sure we take full advantage of their know-how, which is certainly not to be underestimated. Over.
Absolutely great. Thanks, Bruno. Marcus,
Yeah.
anything to add to the oil and gas question?
Well, just a very small thought. I think most have been said by Marco and Bruno, which I concur. And myself as well is part of this knowledge transfer that we spoke about. So I also started in oil and gas with design of production semis for the Gulf of Mexico. But one reflection is, though, that I think in top of what's been said and the obvious sizable balance sheets that comes into this industry, most of these oil majors are, deep water assets and operations are in their DNA. The utilities that built out offshore wind bottom fixed, they came from an onshore environment, starting to dip their toes into shallow water. But these oil majors are mostly from, they have decades and decades of deep water experience. So it's a whole nother discussion and a whole nother way of working and, comfort, and they provide a credibility of making the decisions that are needed, the investments that are appropriate, etc., in deep water operations in very harsh environments. So that's just something to really, keep in mind and think about when these players come in to the deep water arena.
Yeah, perfect. Great. Thanks very much, Marcus. Then yeah, we've also received an interesting question around port infrastructure, because it's always being mentioned that obviously suitable ports are needed. And yeah, what would you say are the key requirements for ports in order to be suitable for floating offshore wind, or maybe some of the constraints that we're sometimes seeing which make ports unsuitable for floating? Any views on what really makes a good port? Yeah, Bruno, feel free to go ahead.
Well, I think the first thing we have to stress is that every technology, and floating wind technology, has different requirements. Is it because of the type of material they use for hull construction, concrete versus steel, or just the dimensions of their floater, especially when they're equipped with wind turbines that are 16 to 20 megawatt. So those and the draft of their structure. But there's one common point, and that is at some point having harbors and quays that are capable of fitting those turbines, where you have the rotor and nacelle assembly that will be soon close to 1,000 tons. So that is already one major element, having those harbors that are equipped to enable a few units along the quays and with quays that can manage the installation and the fitting of towers, and especially rotor and nacelle assemblies that are increasingly heavier. So that is something that can be used by, and that is it can be put to good use by all the different technology providers. After that, I do stress we cannot generalize floating wind. You have floating wind structures that are when fitted with a 16 megawatt wind turbine that are 100 meters by 100 meters and 30 meters high, and others that are half that size. You do have technologies that require a shipyard and dry docks, and others that can that only require a sizable yard near shore. I mean, next to the harbor or within the harbor. So I would say every technology has requirements, but also that opens the door to secondary harbors, because we often talk about the principal and the largest harbors in the world capable of accommodating the construction, the launching, and the storage of commercial scale wind farms. But you do have secondary harbors that also offer tremendous potential. And our goal as an industry is trying to provide jobs to the local community as close as possible to the offshore installation site. So I would say never underestimate the capabilities that a smaller harbor that perhaps once in its heyday used to be a big harbor in its heydays has been kind of abandoned. Last but not least, and to illustrate the fact that all technologies are different, 2 years ago we did an audit, a year and a half ago, an audit of, as a company, of all the harbors of California, all along the coast from Eureka all the way to San Diego. And we realized that we were the only company, for example, and the only technology that could build 50 units in at least 2 harbors in California that without requiring any infrastructure upgrades, without any investments whatsoever. So that is the other issue. Some technologies will require investments in harbor infrastructure upgrades, some others not. But again, let's not underestimate the potential of harbors that have been abandoned and that are no longer in activity today.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Bruno. Perfect. Yeah, Marco, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's an important aspect, of course, the difference in technologies and what that brings to ports. I think an important element is flexibility that the design can bring. What I see now is that when we speak to ports and projects, we can always design. Look at that design and make it suitable for the specific boundaries that apply to the region where we develop these projects. So this is an important aspect, and indeed it should also create possibilities for the smaller shipyards, especially when we go from where we are now, maybe 5 units, to a higher amount of units, and where do these fabrication sites cater that. We will probably see that we have to use more fabrication sites or shipyards, and you're looking at huge logistics of the weights that each design brings, or components that are part of the design, all the logistics that come with that. The more we get to the larger scale projects, these are important things. How much area do you require? How strong does the soil needs to be? The bearing capacity. What do you do with the floaters that are ready? Need to be integrated with the turbines. Where do you store them? Do you need to dry store them? Do you need to wet store them? The difference in technologies will have different challenges in that respect. So of course, floaters bring a good self floaters will bring a big advantage in that. So you can look at building the structures in components and have them being built maybe somewhere else where it's more complex, and integrate them locally. It's a lot of elements that needs to be brought in the picture, and create and offer solutions for local content and address that. So the more flexibility a design can bring, the easier you can address these things and help the local infrastructure.
Great, thanks, Marco. Marcus, anything to add to the port discussion?
I think most have been said, but I think it's an interesting reflection to make that if we look at oil and gas, which, typically a lot of shipyards have been built up and their infrastructure has been built up on oil and gas and shipping. And there's a whole nother type of cost pressure that we're facing here in renewables and offshore wind, which calls for, when we talk to shipyards and then get through some planning, it's really evident that we're not talking here about needing to use only the major, the really large shipyards and using their dry docks. That's not the efficient and cost-effective way to do things. So I really, agree with the comments here to reflect on other secondary or smaller shipyards, or even, large areas or key sites that are, applicable to with some upgrades to be used as well. So there's a lot of potential areas, and really to get out of the thinking that floating wind can only be fabricated in really, really big shipyards with dry docks. That's not the case at all.
Great, perfect. Thanks very much, Marcus. And yeah, then actually a different topic, we're receiving quite a lot of questions around whether floating wind can be used for producing green hydrogen. So is that something you see already as part of the floating story, being coupled with hydrogen production facilities? Or would you say that's something maybe that bottom fixed offshore wind can start and then floating at a later point? Any views on the coupling of floating wind with hydrogen production facilities?
If I can go ahead, just
Marcus, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, please go ahead,
sorry.
Mark.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I completely agree. I think that it's probably, we've got a few years still to bring down the cost of producing hydrogen. But I think looking a bit longer ahead, I think it has a tremendous potential. And I think the power generation part of decarbonizing is easy to understand how it can be done, but we've got a lot of other things to do in terms of industry and transport sector, etc. And here hydrogen can really play a part. And we're engaged now in a joint industry project in Spain, actually, with Acciona on integrating floating wind with hydrogen. And I think a vision, at least that I have, where it makes so perfect sense, floating wind with hydrogen, is both the unlimited access to water for the electrolyzers, but also consider a scenario where you, with floating wind together with hydrogen, have the potential to get out of connections to shore with price pressures and demand centers, nearby, etc. You could imagine a case where you have shuttle tankers back and forth between this offloading hydrogen, even a future scenario of green shipping, where ships are, fueled by hydrogen that are being tanked at these floating foundations. So there's a great opportunity. And one example also in transforming decarbonizing industry, we've got a big project underway in Sweden, which we're not running in any way, but the steel production, which is quite big here in Sweden, are looking to fully decarbonize that steel production through hydrogen. And that's done at the scale of things and the amount of electricity that is needed to do this shift. It's just mind-blowing. So I think it has great opportunity. It fits well with floating wind, but it needs a lot of power at scale. So to produce that power from offshore wind, and not the least floating, where scale is really an opportunity, it's a perfect fit. But there is some work to be done in bringing that cost down of the levelized cost of hydrogen.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks, Marcus. Anything to add, Bruno or Marco, on hydrogen? Yeah, Marco, please go ahead.
Yeah. Principal Power is involved in these R&D projects as well. We are looking at it, and we also see here again gaining momentum towards that. Also again by the momentum in the world around us to find different sources of energy. An important aspect, of course, is also that we need to electrify our industries. We need to create also the demand for the electricity. But coming back to what Principal Power is doing, we're looking at it at centralized production of hydrogen, but we're also looking at using the surface of the payload of our platforms to have it the hydrogen production that take place there. So there are different possibilities that we're looking at. So yes, we definitely see this the potential for hydrogen combined with floating wind. You can look also at existing infrastructure from oil and gas pipeline networks to use that to bring the produced hydrogen onshore. So there is so much potential and building blocks for us to explore that and accelerate that. And also, yeah, general thing for floating for offshore wind is the fact that we need to electrify our industries. I think we're doing that, of course, all with cars. That's a strong incentive there already. But I think for a large part for the fabrication industry, we need to the same needs to happen here.
Great, thanks very much, Marco. Bruno, any final thoughts, because we're nearing the end of this webinar? Any final remarks?
No, just I agree, hydrogen, but like many other technologies, are fully compatible with floating wind, and have to be considered with floating wind. Having said that, our first challenge is keeping on reducing the cost of floating wind, and the same way we'll leave it to the hydrogen specialists to reduce the cost of their technology, and sooner or later those two technologies will find a common ground. But let's not try to put too much on our plate at this point. Let's not ignore this hydrogen issue. Let's not ignore the need to store the renewable energy we're going to produce. But our first challenge is putting more floating wind in the water and in as many places in the world as possible, and consequently bring the cost down. I would conclude with that.
That sounds great. Yeah, excellent conclusion. And yeah, that already brings us to the end of this webinar. So thanks very much to our three speakers, Bruno, Marco, and Marcus, for your insights. I think it's been extremely interesting. So thank you very much. And thank you very much also to the audience, yeah, for listening and dialing in today. You can also listen to the full recording of this webinar and all our previous webinars on our YouTube channel. And yeah, please also make sure to dial in for our next month's webinar on offshore wind technology update. It will be on April 15th. So yeah, thank you very much again to our three panelists and to all of you for listening, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.